In these next two videos, we're going to take a look at adaptations to exercise, and more specifically, we're going to look at cardiovascular adaptations to exercise. Now, it's important that you understand this table. It is a little bit different, so you've got to pay attention here. What we're doing is we're looking at the value of the variable before training, so pre-training, and then post-training at rest. And so this one is easy. The person just comes in and sits there, and we measure heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, so on and so forth. We do the same thing for submaximal steady-state exercise, but you need to look down here and notice that this is an absolute exercise bout. And so they're doing the same amount of exercise post-training as they did pre-training. And so that's what you can see here. And then finally, the last comparison that we look at is the variable during maximal exercise. And again, here's pre-training and here's post-training. And then we put them through an appropriate cardiovascular training program or an aerobic training program. And so it's of sufficient intensity and duration that it's going to stimulate significant change. And so we start by looking at heart rate. And you all know that a trained person tends to have lower heart rate than an untrained person. And here you can see that heart rate will go down at rest. It also goes down during submaximal exercise because, again, they're doing the same thing, but they're more fit. So now it's easier. So it shouldn't be surprising to you that heart rate has decreased. Here's the one that catches people. They think they're doing more work, so their maximum heart rate must be higher. But no, indeed. If you do aerobic training for long enough, you'll see a decrease in even maximum heart rate, even though the person is capable of doing more work, as you can see down here. After training, they're able to reach a higher workload before exhaustion. Here's one of the more important changes that occur, especially for people who are athletes that have to do a lot of running or distance swimming or whatever. You can see that stroke volume, in fact, will increase. And so down here you can see that a resting stroke volume has a fairly larger range. It can be anywhere from 60 to 100 milliliters or so. And again, that is milliliters per beat. So I should have included that. And you can see that it increases at rest. It increases during submaximal exercise, and it even increases for maximal exercise. And so now it's higher than it was. And this person is not a great endurance athlete because that's a nice increase in stroke volume. But endurance athletes will have stroke volumes in excess of 120 milliliters per beat. So it can get way up here. Cardiac output tends not to change at rest unless there's been a big change in body mass. You can see that there's actually just a small change during submaximal steady-state exercise. And this is partly because the subject is now a little bit more efficient. And so they're able to do the same amount of exercise, but they don't have to pump quite as much blood. Part of that is because, oh, look at this, they extract a little bit more blood as it moves through the systemic capillary. And then here you can see that there is also an increase in Qmax. Qmax has gone up. Again, this isn't a real large value. We see endurance athletes who are up close to 30 liters per minute. So 19.1 is good, but it's not way, way up there. Here's our AVO2 difference. And so again, this is the amount of oxygen that's been extracted from the blood as it moves through the systemic capillary. It doesn't really change at all, if any, at rest. During submaximal exercise, it goes up a tiny amount, and during maximal exercise, it goes up a little bit. If the person continued to train for a couple of years, in fact, it would continue to increase and get even higher than that. But that's a long-term change. It takes a lot of time for that to occur. Here's VO2 in liters per minute. Here's VO2 in mLs per kg per minute. This is just a tad bit high. Some later data suggests that this can vary a lot more from individual to individual than we've thought for a long time. But again, just like cardiac output, submaximal exercise VO2 has gone down a little bit. And that's because, well, heart rate has gone down. And so the heart doesn't need quite as much oxygen. Breathing rate has also gone down, and so the diaphragm and the external intercostals and other muscles of respiration don't need quite as much oxygen. And so we see this small decrease. not a huge one, just a small one. Doesn't mean that it's a higher exercise intensity because they're doing the same work. It just means that it's easier for them. They're more efficient. And then you can see a nice increase in VO2 max, expressed both as liters per minute and mLs per kg per minute. Just general typical increase is about 20%, but that can vary a tremendous amount. It partly depends on health and training status. And so if we take a healthy endurance athlete and train them, we'll be lucky to get a 2% increase in their VO2 max. On the other hand, if someone has been sick and confined to bed for more than a couple of weeks, then you could easily get well over a 20% increase in VO2 max. Here you can see a graph of some data for heart rates. And so they're comparing healthy college-age people in an untrained state when they're sedentary, and then that same group after they've trained for a few months. And you can see resting and submaximal exercise heart rates have gone down. There's even a slight decrease in maximum heart rate, although that likely wouldn't be statistically significant. But if they continue to train, here you can see those endurance athletes, maximum heart rate has gone down even more, and so now it probably will be statistically significant. And resting heart rate can only go down so much, so it's gone down a bit more, but it hasn't gone down a whole lot. And so again, I want to reiterate that maximal heart rate decreases with enough aerobic training. And again, the change is going to be related to the length of training and the fitness level of the group when they start their training. And again, here this group was indeed sedentary, and so they didn't train at all when they started. The decrease in heart rate is due to several things. One is just a slowing of the intrinsic rate of the heart. You might remember that if we cut the vagus nerve and we cut the cardioaccelerator nerve, the heart would continue to beat on its own. Well, that pacemaker potential slope will flatten a little bit. A second thing that happens is we get an increase in the parasympathetic nervous system tone. Remember, PNS is rest and digest, and so it helps to decrease heart rate, especially post-exercise, but even at rest and even during exercise. And then less important, but still plays a role, is the sympathetic nervous system activity doesn't go up as much for submaximal exercise as it did before training. Here you can see stroke volume. And we're going to look at some data that's a little bit different than this. Some of the earlier data said that stroke volume would increase for a bit, but then it would plateau at about 40, 50, 60% of VO2 max. And so that's what you can see here. By the way, these arrows that you see, these indicate the individual reaching exhaustion and saying, okay, can't go any further. So you see stroke volume is going up from somewhere around 60 to 100. It's going up, in this case, about 100 for maximum. I guess it creeps up to about 105 over here. But look at these endurance athletes. They're actually over 140, over 150. So they can get up there pretty high. This is partly due to an increase in the size of the ventricle. So now it can hold more blood. And remember, a higher EDV means a higher stroke volume. The heart rate is slower, and so there's more time to fill the ventricle with blood. And then aerobic exercise is good for the heart and arterial stiffness. It helps to improve compliance. So it doesn't take quite as much pressure to fill this guy up and get it full of blood. Here you can see slightly different data. Here the stroke volume is continuing to go up for a bit longer. Now they've expressed it as treadmill speed, but it's still stroke volume compared to exercise intensity. It does start to plateau a bit here towards the end, both in the untrained and in the trained state. This also shows you stroke volume. You remember that stroke volume is EDV minus ESV, and so here's resting stroke volume. And then here's EDV. It increases considerably as you go from rest to moderate exercise. And then it increases a bit more, but not a whole lot, as you progress from moderate to high intensity exercise. On the other hand, end systolic volume just goes down gradually the whole time as we go from rest to mild to moderate to intense exercise. And when we look at the change in EDV, it goes from about 87 up to about 114, and that represents approximately a 30% increase from rest to peak exercise. Interestingly, if we do the math here, we'll find that this change is also close to 30%. Again, a normal healthy adult has a resting stroke volume somewhere around 60 to 100 milliliters per beat. 60 to 100 milliliters per beat. And then here you can see some data comparing untrained to elite athletes. These guys aren't just trained, they're actually elite. And so now look at these stroke volumes. These stroke volumes are incredibly high, in excess of 180 milliliters per beat. What they've ignored here is they've ignored that increase from rest up to maximum stroke volume. So 120 isn't a bad stroke volume. That's pretty good for a college student, but it's nowhere near what it would be for a highly trained person. Here you can see a comparison of cardiac output for, again, untrained, and then that same group trained, and Qmax has gone up. And then here is the elite group. And here you can see that Qmax is actually in excess of 30. Again, for a trained sedentary person, a Qmax of 25 is pretty decent. That's not too bad. And then here we see the data on the same group of people for stroke volume. And again, this group that's highly trained, you see these elite athletes, you continue to see an increase in the stroke volume, getting up over 180 milliliters with each beat of the heart. And that's just incredibly impressive. And this is probably the major difference between elite endurance athletes and non-elite endurance athletes. And now we'll look at some physical changes in the heart itself. And so the myocardium of the wall is what makes up the ventricular wall. This part of the wall that divides the left and right ventricles is referred to as the septum. And here you can see that when you do aerobic exercise, the major thing that happens is you get an increase in the size of the left ventricle in particular. As a result of that, there's an increase in ventricular volume. EDV goes up, stroke volume goes up. On the other hand, when you lift heavy weights, the heart has to pump against an increased resistance to blood flow. And so it's like it also is doing resistance training. And you see that the ventricular wall and the septum hypertrophy. So here you see that the major change is this way, as opposed to an increase in the size of the ventricle. This is just a different graph that shows you the same thing. You don't see the ventricular volume increasing quite as distinctly as you see it here. The other interesting thing is there's some data that suggests that in bodybuilders who lift much higher volumes than traditional weightlifters and who have very short rest periods might in fact see a little bit of an increase in ventricular volume as well as an increase in the thickness of the wall. So again, bodybuilders, high volume, short rest periods, they get more cardiovascular change than more traditional type weightlifters. And here's some data looking at left ventricular mass for male and females trained and then different athletes. And so you can see here are endurance runners, and you look at the women, and they've got a greater left ventricular mass than the sedentary males. Even though men tend to have bigger hearts than women, you can see that's not the case for these endurance athletes. And then here are cyclists and cross-country skiers, also endurance athletes, and you can see that the results look to be about the same as for the endurance runners. Again, remember, that's primarily due to an increase in the size of the ventricular volume. Here, wrestlers and shot putters are going to do more resistance training, and they get a hypertrophy of the ventricular wall and the septum as well. And so the increase in the mass is bigger, but the ventricular volume isn't quite as big. Here you can see cardiac output during incremental exercise. And again, one of the major changes is that Qmax goes up and up. And so again, this Qmax is getting up close to 30. We see Qmaxes that do get a little bit past 30. So this is really good, but it's not the best we might see. And then the other thing that you see usually is that there's perhaps a slight decrease in submaximal cardiac output. Again, it's a little bit easier for the athlete. Heart rate's not as high. The muscles of respiration aren't working quite as hard. And so Q can be a little bit lower as well. And then here's the AVO2 difference. And again, the major change is that AVO2 difference max has increased. So an increase here. Notice that the maximum AVO2 difference for the trained college student is about the same as for the endurance athlete. Now, the endurance athlete, if they can continue to work out hard, could continue to increase that AVO2 difference at maximum exercise a bit more. But that's a very long-term change, and it does indeed take a while. Now, remember that cardiac output times AVO2 difference will give us VO2. And so this is also showing you two of the three things that are compared when we look at the Fick equation. And so we might argue that AVO2 difference is really an adaptation of respiration, as this is part of internal respiration. And so we may come back to it when we look at the second video on cardiovascular adaptations. This is just some data on VO2 maxes of male and female athletes. Males over here to the left. And again, you look at the cross-country skiers, distance runners, triathletes, and you can see that they have the highest VO2 maxes. Women tend to be kind of similar, but the cyclists are out here and so are the rowers. This data is a little bit older, so it really would be interesting to see it redone, especially with the female athletes, because the numbers would go up quite a bit. So it would be interesting to see what kind of changes we might see there. Here you can see comparison of cardiovascular responses, trained and untrained, again to incremental exercise. And as we said before, the Q for submaximal exercise drops a little bit. And so here's my attempt to fix it. Obviously didn't do a very good job here. But Qmax clearly goes up. That's one of the major distinctions that we will see. Here you see stroke volume increasing in the trained state. And these are pretty high increases in stroke volume if this is just college people who are working out, if they're not really endurance athletes. And then there's our decrease in heart rate. Again, if they were to continue to exercise longer, maximum heart rate would go down a little bit more. And then finally, here's VO2. I want you to remember that this is incremental exercise, so it would be better if the x-axis were workload or something like that. And so, again, submaximal exercise VO2 will be a little bit lower because the person has improved their efficiency, a bit more efficient now. This is showing you the number of capillaries that we find relative to the cross-sectional area of muscle fibers. And so here you can see two different muscle fibers. Presumably, this is a type 1 and this is a type 2. And here are the capillaries. The dashed line shows you that they've cut through these muscle fibers here, and there are the capillaries. This is the untrained state. Training can, in fact, contribute to angiogenesis, creation of blood vessels. And so now you can see the cross-sectional area hasn't really changed at all through endurance exercise, but there are now more capillaries per muscle fiber. It probably would be more apparent in these type 1 or slow twitch fibers than it would be in the type 2s. But there you go. And again, there is a little bit of data that suggests that power lifters might be able to stimulate some angiogenesis as well. And again, I'm going to reiterate, bodybuilders tend to use a very high volume, lots of repetitions with very short rest periods. And that brings us to the end of the first video on adaptations to exercise. I probably should have put the two together because the next one will be pretty short.